Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
So, about 9 years ago, my boyfriend, now husband who is 44 years old, and I, a 40-year-old woman, were driving cross-country from California to Florida. My husband had an enormous Rottweiler named Kuma. It means bear in Japanese, and it fit. He was 110 pounds. I had only just met Kuma maybe 2 days prior, since my hubby and I were in a long-distance relationship at the time. So Kuma and I, didn't know each other well yet, but he was a great boy and talked a lot. We called them Umbo Crumbles. We stopped at a gas station so that we could all get out, stretch, and use the restrooms. He got Kuma on his leash and said he'd take him for a walk. I offered to do it instead since I didn't need to use the restroom urgently. Now, I'm not a small girl, I'm 5'10", but I am 125 pounds. My husband is almost 6'5" and built like a Viking, so a dog Kuma's size wouldn't affect him one way or another if he tried to bowl chasing a squirrel or something. I, on the other hand, will admit I was nervous once he handed me the leash to hold him because if he decided to try anything, I wasn't big or strong enough to stop him. My husband noticed my nervousness. He just smiled and said, "Don't worry, he's well trained. He won't take off, and he won't let anything happen to you." It's important to note that Kuma had no formal protection training. He just loved whatever his dad did and knew he was supposed to protect and keep it safe when dad wasn't there to do it himself. Once he was sure I was comfortable, my husband headed inside, leaving Kuma and I near the far right side of the gas station, with a little dirt path near a wooded area. It was very dark, and there was little light being shed so far from the building, but it was a busy little station, and I could see people so I didn't feel isolated or anything. So I start to walk slowly, allowing Kuma to take in his surroundings when I hear a noise coming from behind me. I turn startled to see a man walking. He notices me and slows his gait, looks around, back at me, then smiles eerily. He changes direction suddenly, heading directly towards me. He says it's awful dangerous out here alone. But you're alone. Something in his eyes told me to run. Just as I'm about to bolt and start hustling towards the people and lights of the station, I hear another sound. This one is new to me. As I clenched my hand, preparing to run or die fighting off this creepy guy, I felt something. Kuma. In that moment, I'd forgotten that I wasn't alone at all. Not by a long shot. The sound I had heard was a warning, a very lethal one. It was the deepest, most menacing growl I have ever heard come out of anything. That beautiful beast stepped out from behind me, where he'd been observing the threat like a giant dragon rising from the shadows. The man's creepy smile slipped right off his face, as did a few shades of color. Kuma placed his large body between mine and the approaching strangers and pressed back against me, urging me towards the jeep. He didn't have to tell me twice. I turned and started to make my way back to the car, still holding that leash for dear life. He walked backward, pressed against me the whole time, watching my back until we made it back to where we had parked. I tried to look for the man, but he either ran back to wherever he'd come from or made it inside, taking a much longer route, well outside Kuma's reach. I told my husband what happened, and honestly, I'm not sure who would have done more damage to that unfortunate man had they located him. Every day for the next 9 years, Kuma was my best friend and guardian. Rest in peace, Kuma. I, a 20-year-old woman, work part-time at a small business in my local mall and usually work alone. I am a sales associate, so I am required to talk to customers and encourage them to buy things. It was the last hour of my shift when a creepy man came in. He was about in his middle 40s and everything about him was odd. His clothes didn't fit, expensive shoes, socially awkward. He originally asked a pretty standard question about a less expensive item that I happily answered. After this though, he continued to ask questions almost as if he wanted to keep my attention to him. He then asked if he could try out our most expensive item in the store, which is a massage chair, and I say yes. We let everyone try it out. At this point, I just thought he was an innocent yet socially awkward guy. He gets in the chair to try it out and continues to ask unusual questions. We chit-chat a bit, and I tell him the massage chair's features and the price of it. All of a sudden, the questions get more personal. He asked what high school I went to and if I missed it. Me being naive, I said the high school I went to and that I did not miss going. He said some story about a teacher I've never heard of and said he missed high school a lot. He asked if I lived around there, to which I avoided the question but implied that I lived close. He then repeatedly asked me the price of the chair and asked me to calculate the price along with our second most expensive item in the store. I thought he was fully interested and I was convinced he was about to buy it. We made commission on the chair, so I ignored his creepiness because I wanted to make the sale. He kept insisting that he needed to walk out with the chair today and he has a truck that is big enough to hold it. It seemed I had finally answered his questions to his liking because I was able to walk away a bit. He then made a phone call call and started describing how I look, my age, where I live approximately, and what store I worked at. He then said to the person on the phone, we got one. I had suspicions that he was creepy, but this confirmed it. I asked him from behind the cashier's counter, you're not talking about me, right? He shook his head no. He then stood up from the chair and said he will not be buying the chair today. I was so scared and alone, no one else around but me. I ran to the back and grabbed all my stuff and pulled out my pocket knife. He then left the store and hung out right outside the only entrance/exit. I didn't want to leave, but I couldn't stay inside the mall. I waited for him to go out of sight and then quickly locked the store doors and ran outside to my car. I called my manager and she said I have to close the store properly, turn off lights, count register. So she told me to go into a nearby store in the mall and call a security escort. I did that, was escorted back to the store to close up, and was escorted back to my car with no further incident. I live in a city with one of the highest rates of human trafficking in the country. Was I being targeted by a human trafficker? My mom decided to tell my dad, my brother, and me an incredibly secret one-word code that would only be used to verify that we are who we say we are in case of a dangerous situation, or something like that. It's a pretty unique word, if you can even call it that. It's almost inconceivable to be mentioned in regular conversation. We all thought it was pretty corny, but we all agreed to remember it, and all of us talk about the code in conversation every once in a while. Note that my mom came up with this code several years after we had moved away to a different state, California, from our hometown, Illinois. Fast forward to last week, a tradition of our family is to go back to our hometown for Thanksgiving every year, and my dad's and uncle's birthday is within that week, so we usually celebrate their birthday during this week as well. We decided, since it was my father's 50th birthday, that we'd go to a dive bar with my family and my parents' high school friends. Vibes were great, and it was the first time our whole family had been out together for several years. About an hour in, a late 60s to early 70s man wearing a bar staff shirt came up to me, my brother and my mom, and said this incredibly secret aforementioned family code. The way he said it was so deliberate, it was like he knew how much the code meant to my family. We all looked at each other with very perplexing gazes, like we all wanted to say something to each other, but as soon as we looked at each other, he went over to where he was sitting prior to this incident. My brother went over to talk to him a few minutes later, but I forget what he had said to him. Nothing noteworthy as far as I know. Later that night, he and my dad were outside smoking and gave my dad a rock. It was a dark brown rock with dark orange streaks passing through the rock. I think my dad gave it to my mom, and my mom threw it away. My mom believed that the rock was some sort of bad omen. This really did happen. My brother and I think it's a clever prank that my mom has pulled, but she usually cracks when this happens and we ask her a few times. I wouldn't think she would have joked about this in the first place, but it's the only logical thing that we could possibly come up with. Even the day following, my brother and I asked my mom about this incident again, and she remained very adamant about her having no involvement in this. My dad isn't the prank pulling kind of guy and wasn't even there to see it go down. No negative connotation, but it's just not in his nature to ask a stranger to do something like that, so it eliminates him from doing something like this. We asked him anyway, and to no surprise, he said he had no involvement. It's a creepy interaction we'll likely never forget. We haven't lived there for roughly 20 years, and the only family member living there is my grandmother, who is in her 80s and I don't think even knows how to get the phone number of said bar. As mentioned previously, some of my parents' high school friends still live here. However, it was an on-the-fly decision to go to this dive bar we aren't frequents, and it's located in a medium-sized city, about 150,000 people. Nobody had posted its whereabouts on socials until later that night or afterwards. This goes back to when I was about 12. We lived in a really bad neighborhood at the time. It was me, my little sister, and our parents. This was the kind of neighborhood you lived in when you had literally no other option. It was a miserable existence. I was often tasked with watching my little sister, who is 3 years younger than me. I also hated this, and I had gone to play with some neighborhood kids and ended up staying out later than we were supposed to. I remember trying to rush my sister because I was afraid I would get in trouble. I don't know why this one specific part sits in my head still and makes me sad to think about, but I remember pulling her arm really hard because she wasn't keeping up. On our way home, we ran into these two older guys from our neighborhood. They were somewhere in the range of late teenagers to early 20s. Literally everybody in our neighborhood hated these two. They were always starting fights, playing their music too loud, and driving way too fast. Just the kind of people that you wouldn't want to hang around. As I'm pulling my little sister, one of them charges at me and picks me up. 12-year-old me wasn't having any of that, so I was fighting him, but eventually he just took me and physically threw me in his backyard. I don't remember how the other bit happened, but the other one grabbed my sister and followed us. This would make sense to me later, but I noticed that their behavior was much more erratic than usual. For instance, one of them would periodically grab me by the head and squeeze it around my ears. This terrified me because I thought they were going to kill us. I was crying, but my sister oddly enough held it together. I also recall they would randomly just scream things at us. Nothing about them was making any sort of sense. This went on for almost an hour, then a cop car passed and I remember screaming for help. He didn't hear me, but the two guys ended up letting us go. We ran home and told our parents. My dad would go and talk to these two, but he didn't do anything about it. I was told many years later by my mom, long after we had actually moved away from there and into a good neighborhood, that on that night in question one of our neighbors had brutally killed his wife and mother. Had we kept running, we would have been in the midst of that. These two guys pretty much abducted us for the sake of protecting us, as weird as that sounds. From what I could piece together, they would scream at us and cover our ears to prevent us from having to hear what was going on. Could have gone about it a lot better, but what's done is done. I'm writing this out because I actually ran into one of those older boys recently. He's actually a cop now and has been on the force for about 10 years. He is very decorated and seems to be making an effort to keeping the streets safe. It was a creepy and scary encounter, but I'm glad that there are people that still want to do some level of good. A little context for this one, just so you know, this ended up being longer than I expected. I, a 32-year-old woman, usually get around town in my own car, but I've used Uber on multiple occasions. This is not Uber bashing, by the way. Most times it is a safe and reliable service, which is why I use it. And I try not to be paranoid despite the stories of women that have gone missing this way. Anyway, this means that every woman I know has thought about what they would do if they found themselves in this situation. Stuff like being on the phone with someone the whole ride, not falling asleep no matter how tired or drunk you are, sharing your location through another app, assessing whether jumping out of a moving car is worth the risk, and even carrying weapons. I carry a pocket knife and I learned to use it. Survivors have told stories of their driver going quiet, turning off the app, and changing routes to streets they don't recognize. They try to pass it off as taking shortcuts. That being said, one day after work I had to take a taxi home, and I scheduled an Uber as usual. The car rolled up, the make and model matched, the plates matched, and the driver looked like the photo. So far so good. I climbed inside the car, greeted the driver, and immediately shared my live location with my hubby, letting him know I was on the way. As an extra precaution, I always checked that the locks could be disengaged by hand, and bonus points to cars with windows that could be cranked down manually. The drive started normal. Driver was an older guy, friendly. We struck up a conversation, you know, small talk. We found a lot of traffic and the driver asked if I wanted to take an alternate route. I pointed at an access road that I normally use to skip traffic, and he switched lanes. We were going down the access road, and this is when things started getting sketchy. He said that he made a wrong turn, and we kept driving farther and farther away from the main road, supposedly looking for a way to get back on track. The app was still running as normal, and the GPS was telling him how to get back on the main road, but he kept ignoring it, saying that we were not too far away anyway and that he knew another way to get to my destination faster. So this is when alarms start going off in my head, especially because we kept getting closer to a bad part of town. True, if you cross those neighborhoods you could find another main road on the other side, but most people avoid it for it being the aforementioned bad part of town. Like, police don't even patrol those streets sometimes. As he drives deeper into the neighborhood, he notices I'm tensing up. Truth is, I was debating whether I should reach for my knife, or if I was being super paranoid, and the driver was honestly just trying to get to the other main road. So he starts telling me about the neighborhood and that I shouldn't be scared, that it was dangerous, but that good people live there. Honestly, I wasn't so worried about the people living in the neighborhood as I was about this guy taking the scenic route. So I started talking to about how I was aware there was a road that crossed to the other side and that I knew exactly where I was. The conversation at some point turned to his daughter, who was college aged, and I kept making as many parallels as I could between that girl and myself. Hand on my pocket knife by this point, the other hand ready to unbuckle the seatbelt, while I kept an eye on the map to make sure we were getting closer to the other main road, and thankfully we were. I did not begin to relax until I started recognizing where we were. We did eventually make it to my own neighborhood, and I made him stop a block before reaching my house. Didn't want the guy to know where I actually lived, and I skipped out of there as fast as I could. I really hope I was just being paranoid and that I was never actually in any danger, but all I have to say is that was an intense ride. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. Just for context, for my job I'm on call 24/7 and my company is only required to give me a 2-hour heads up before coming into work. I usually leave my apartment 20 to 30 minutes before I have to be at work. I typically get called to work between 9 at night and 4 in the morning though. One Tuesday morning I had to be at work by 2 in the morning. I am ahead of schedule getting ready and I see that my wife, let's call her Jan, places the trash near the door for me to take out. It is about 1 in the morning when I decide to take the trash out. Now usually when I go to work at that time during the week I'm the only one out and about in my apartment complex. When I leave my building and head to the dumpster, which is about 100 feet from my door, I hear a car running. I can be a bit paranoid and always like to know what is going on around me, so as I walk to the dumpster and I try to figure out what car. It was then I realized it is a car that is parked right next to the dumpster and right next to my car. All of their lights were off so no one could tell outside of the sound that it was that particular car. Because of that my gut was telling me something isn't right, so I throw the trash away and head back inside to finish getting ready. About 30 minutes later I go to leave and the car that was running still parked right next to my car. As I go to get into my car I notice there's someone in the front passenger seat closest to my door. However, due to the dark window tint on the other car I could not see any details of the person, so I quickly throw my bags in my car and head to work. I usually mess with music before pulling out, but my gut told me forget the music and get out of there as soon as possible. After I get to work, 20 minutes after I left, I see a text from Jan that says our dog woke her up to go to the bathroom. The timestamp is from about 5 minutes after I left. I immediately tell her to take the dog out back, which is a bit more private and not in the designated spot out front because she would have to walk by the car that was running with someone in it and the designated spot isn't well lit. Jan responds about 5 minutes later and tells me she forgot her phone. She then tells me that when she took the dog out in the designated area she too noticed the car running and she too got a weird gut feeling. Remember, Jan had no clue about my feeling until after this happened to her. Jan said that after she took the dog to the designated spot the car that was running moved from the previous spot where the dumpster blocked their view of her to a spot where they could easily see her. She then noticed a man in a dark colored hoodie walking towards her from the general area where the car's new spot is. Now this is a fairly warm time and once again 1 to 2 in the morning on a Tuesday morning, so very odd. She said the man simply walked by her but he too gave her a strange feeling. She feels that somehow they are connected given the fact that they both occurred so close together. A few weeks later we found out from our apartment complex that there had been car break-ins recently. We couldn't help but wonder if that car or the man had anything to do with it. This happened to me in the summer of 2019 when I was a 19-year-old woman and working at a dollar store as a summer job between semesters at university. A guy came into the shop around closing, 9 at night, probably in his late 20s to early 30s, and was obviously high. He had the red eyes, slurred speech, everything. Anyways, I said my normal fake hi and smile. Any retail employee knows what I'm talking about. And just let him into the store. He grabbed a cart and started piling stuff into it, only 20 minutes later to come up to my station saying his weed had worn off and he no longer wanted the pile of stuff in the cart. At this point I was super pissed because that meant I had to put it all back. He paid for a few things, thanking me for being so chill about the fact that he was high, then basically started telling me his whole life story about how his wife left him and took his 3 kids with her, that he was broke, all that stuff. He started asking me what my name was, where I lived. Obviously I lied. He said he would be back and walked out. I thought nothing of it. I noticed that he started coming in a lot more often with his backpack, and he always made eye contact with me, coming up to my station to pay for a bottle of water or something. He kept asking me questions about myself, and I was pretty discreet. I suspected that he was stealing. To be honest, I didn't really care, but he always gave me that look as if I was his accomplice or something. Then it started getting super weird. I didn't tell my boss about him. Granted, I probably should have, but I didn't want to accuse someone of stealing because of their financial status or whatever else might be going on. I didn't want to accuse him in case he was innocent and I was just misunderstanding things. I think she knew something was up though because of how uncomfortable I was whenever he came in, asking if someone could cover me on my station or asking for an early break, stuff like that. I wasn't actually at work for this part, but my boss told me about it later. She said he came into the store in tears, admitting that he had been stealing from the store the last couple of weeks. He told her he had made a list of things he stole and was going to pay it all back. This is where I reminded it was a dollar store. It's not like he snagged the Mona Lisa. I was stocking shelves when I saw him next. He came up the aisle and snuck up behind me, startling me. He insisted he wasn't there to steal, then professed his love to me, insisting that I call him. I didn't even have his number, not that I would have if I did. I wasn't at my station when he went up to pay for a handful of chocolate bars, but my boss was, and she told me he pulled out a wad of bills to pay for them. She asked him where he got the money and he quote responded, "I found a pot of gold." told. She thought he was joking, so she asked him with amusement where he found it, and he quote responded, "I found it next to a dead leprechaun." To say she was freaked out was an understatement. And she told me that if he came back to call her immediately. A week later was when I saw him next, annoyed at the sound of a car in the parking lot. I turned, looking out the window behind my station to see a car. It looked like an expensive blue sports car, maybe like a Lamborghini or something, I'm not sure, but it was definitely expensive. It was racing through the parking lot very loudly and stopped right in front of the store. I watched him get out and my eyes widened in shock. He was in an expensive black suit, hair gelled back. He looked like he just came out of a board meeting. So he comes into the store, and before I could even call my boss over the speaker, he was up at my station, leaning towards me and saying, "So, when are you gonna call me?" in like this flirty/seductive way. I don't remember what I said, probably made up some excuse. I transferred stores to another city for school not long after, so I never saw him again, but I still remember his face that last time when he looked at me like a piece of meat instead of a person. I also question what he meant when he said a dead leprechaun. My friends think he won the lottery. My mother thinks that he got an inheritance from a dead relative, but I'm not sure. I'll try and keep this story as short as I can, but so much of what makes it creepy is in the details and atmosphere surrounding my experience. My mother and myself decided to visit Nevada City on a whim. It's an old-timey Victorian-era mining/logging town built in 1856. Look at pictures on Google if you really want to see a creepy town. It looks haunted without having to try. After eating lunch at a brew pub, we decided to stroll around the massive Pioneer Historical Cemetery on the outskirts of town. It wasn't quite dusk, but the trees are really tall in this area, so daylight is hard to gauge, and it usually feels later than it is. This cemetery was sprawling. I mean, most pioneer cemeteries are, because of the high mortality rate of the time, and lots of child graves. As we progress through the cemetery, it starts like a proper cemetery with large, ornate tombs/mausoleums, marble obelisks, family plots, stuff like that. What's wild about this cemetery is that it stretches on almost forever into the woods. As we follow the cemetery deeper and deeper into the woods, it becomes hard to tell what's a grave or not, and it's getting more wild and overgrown. It eventually devolved into just wilderness, with the occasional sign of homeless camps like abandoned tents and bags of trash. Luckily, the trees were opening up and more daylight was coming through, and we ended up in an open area with a large solitary juniper tree, tall brush, and a few random graves. I sort of tripped over something, and it turned out to be a purse, like a large designer purse, and it looked super old, like it had been there a while. Looking up from the purse about 10 yards ahead, I saw what looked like a pile of women's clothing, but then I noticed to my horror a tangled massive hair, and I froze. Never know something without actually quote-unquote knowing something. I knew that this was a dead woman's body down to my core. I put a hand out and stopped my mom, who was trailing behind me. "Get your phone, call the police, that's a dead body over there." And she immediately started dialing 911 because, like me, she just knew. Then it gets bananas. As my mom and I are discussing the situation, we had our attention turned away from the corpse. When we looked back at the body, I swear to God, she was sitting up with her back turned to us. She was wearing a bright red trench coat and she had super grimy blonde hair that was more standing up than laying on her shoulders. It's like the grime in her hair allowed it to defy gravity. Slowly, she turned her head over her shoulder like something out of a horror movie and spotted us. She literally jumped to her feet lightning fast and turned to face us. Her front was a mess of torn clothing and she was barely covered. In the weirdest gait I've ever seen, she rapidly advanced on us at a jerking/lurching fashion. Her hands were desperately trying to keep herself covered. My first thought was that she had been assaulted. She kept trying to speak, but it was like she couldn't form words, only make short high-pitched squeaks. As she closed on me, she stopped and pointed down in excitement at the purse I had tripped over. I asked if it was hers, and when I did, her expression changed into a horrible smirk. It still haunts me, and suddenly, she was slowly starting to undress herself, and we had to shout to get her to stop. By this point, we had the cops on the way. We said we had found someone in serious distress. Be that as it may, we both knew this was not a safe situation for us, and we quickly backed away, turned, and cooked it out of there. When we followed up with the police out of concern and morbid curiosity, they said whoever we found must have fled, because they didn't find her. I hope to God she's okay and gets the help she needs. So at around 12 in the morning after I had gotten off work, my boyfriend and I are watching television and had just put a blunt out when there's a knock at the door. We both look at each other in confusion when a second round of knocks goes off. He gets up off the couch, looks out the peephole, and recognizes it's a woman that had talked his head off when he was checking these apartments out before moving in. She's, as he describes, in probably her 50s and very annoying. He sees her every morning when he's going to work and she always waits for him to leave first before driving off. He reluctantly opens the door as I take the paraphernalia out of sight. I can hear her voice, but she's speaking incoherently until he apparently deciphers he and not working, to which he then asks her it's not working. She says yes and asks him to look at it when our cat walks out the door, so he closed it to pick her up. The lady begins walking upstairs, so he brings the cat back in and follows. He sees the woman standing there as he reaches the top of the steps, and from her doorway she says never mind, it's working me, while all the lights in her apartment were off. Pitch black. She then says you can still come in and take a look at it if you want. He says no and decides not to wait around for anything else weird to happen, so he turns around and descends down the steps, returning to our apartment where he sat in silence for 5 minutes trying to piece together what just happened before recalling me with the story I just told you. Fast forward to 1:30 or 2:30 in the morning. My boyfriend is asleep now when I hear steps coming down the stairs and then, you guessed it, knocking. But fate this time, I know it's not on my door, so I look out the eye hole and there she is again, knocking on my neighbor's door, yelling more incoherent words for a solid 5 minutes. Eventually she just walks away with no answer, but not in the direction of the stairs to her apartment. I hear her walk back upstairs maybe an hour later. Strange. Fast forward to now. She's knocking on our door at 3 in the morning, to which of course she got no answer, but as I'm looking out at the peephole I can see her mumbling to herself as she knocks. She walks away like before, the opposite way of the stairs, and I didn't hear her go back upstairs until 10 minutes ago as she stomped her way up there. Obviously very mad. Just a very odd experience I wish I didn't have in the middle of the night while stoned. I'm going to guess early dementia or substance abuse. Update as this happened Friday night. My boyfriend went to his car to go to work Monday morning and noticed a nail drive into the side of his tire. I'm not saying it was her who did this out of rage to her unanswered box, but it was very convenient as he didn't drive all weekend, so there's no telling when it happened. He did however call her complex about the knocking and yelling at all hours of the night. Update 2, it's Thursday now at 1:46 in the morning, almost a week later. Remember how I said my boyfriend normally sees her every morning on his way to work? He hasn't seen her once this entire week. Her car has sat in the same spot as well. Also, we haven't seen a single light from her apartment, not when he gets home at 8 at night nor when I get home at 11 at night. I'm going to see if I'm able to call in a wellness check on her in the morning because I have a feeling something isn't right. I'll continue updating if anything comes about. This just happened to me the other day and I need opinions on whether or not I should be worried. I, a 24-year-old woman, took my son to my mom so she could watch him while I went to work, as she's been doing for the past few years. After leaving her house, I went straight to work, about 7 minutes away. As soon as I pulled up at my job, a truck parked next to me. There are many cars around at other shops as we are directly in town, but I am the only one at my job that morning. I'm thinking it's a customer waiting for us to open, which wouldn't be for another half hour. So I get out of my car with my store key in hand, and the man in the truck says, "You work here." I look at him and he doesn't look familiar, maybe in his early 40s. I said, "Yes, I do." We open at 10 and smiling, he said, "You get your tire fixed." I wasn't immediately alarmed, just trying to think of how he knew I had tire troubles and where I knew him from. But I didn't know him at all. I told him, yeah, that I had to replace 3 tires because I kept running over nails. He was not from the tire shop or anywhere I had been recently. He told me he had also run over a nail and had to replace a tire. Since I had to go to the bank before opening the store, I told him I would be right back and went inside. When I come back out, he says, "You don't remember me, do you?" I told him no and asked where I met him. He said that he remembered I had a baby a few years prior, that I used to drive a little gray car around, and that he helped me out when I had car troubles. I asked if it was when I broke down in town a few years ago, and he said, yeah, that was it. Maybe he did, but I do not remember him ever helping me. My family showed up to help me that day and get my car towed. The whole time he is speaking to me, he's grinning, which didn't seem off in that moment. He then says, "Yeah, I've been seeing you pumping air in your tires at the gas station and thought, man, every time I see her in that little red car, she's pumping her tires." And then I thought I knew her from somewhere, but I was kind of scared to say anything cause you know people can be crazy. Okay, reasonable I guess. He sees me at the store a lot. I was having to pump air in my tires once or twice a week for the past several months until I finally got new ones. So I don't know how many times he saw me at the station. I still frequently stop there for gas and snacks. At this point, I'm still thinking he's a customer waiting, so I tell him I gotta go and will be back soon to open. He says, "Alright then, my name's Ron by the way." I wave at him as I go to get in my car, but then he starts backing up his truck and leaves. That is when I realized that he literally just followed me to work to tell me all that. I was taken aback for a second. It took me a few hours to process the whole encounter. I don't even know at what point between my mom's house and my work he saw me and and began to follow me, but I do pass that gas station on the way to work. I told my husband on my lunch break. He was concerned and believed something was weird about it, as do my mom and a couple of my close friends. Maybe the guy just thought he was being friendly and thought that was a normal thing to do. He may have just been an odd dude. I personally think it's weird for someone to follow me like that. I know not to trust any and everybody, and that you can never be too careful. Just want to know if I should be watching my back more closely. Just had something happen and needed to write it down somewhere. I went to my bank at around 10:45 at night. They have a drive-through ATM, which is behind the bank, away from street view. When you pull up to the ATM, there's basically a curb on the other side, so you can only go forward or backward. So for example, if a car was to pull up behind me and one wait around and pulled up in front of me, I couldn't go anywhere. I'm a 25-year-old dude, 5'11" and built pretty big, so usually I don't have many bad feelings about something. I feel pretty safe in the area I live as well. But as I pull in at the ATM, another car comes behind me, didn't think too much about it, but 10 seconds later, another car pulls up on my right, other side of the curb, and just stays there. Now usually I would just go about my business, but for some reason I had a really bad feeling about how the cars pulled up and how the car to my right just stayed there, doing nothing. There was more than enough space to park randomly in front of the bank. Why stay next to me and wait there? My gut was telling me to get out of there, so I acted casual, as if I was finishing up, took back my debit card as fast as I could without acting weird, and got out of there. To this day, I tell myself sometimes I probably overreacted, but it kind of haunts me to think how easy it would have been for them to trap me there and force me to give them all I had. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.